Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me as always is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, how are you doing today?
Doing very well. How are you, Michael?
I'm also doing well. We're going a little bit off the beaten path today. In a sense, we've been going through the S&I mempool crash course, talking about kind of our vision from 2013 to 2015 or so of what Bitcoin would become. Last week we discussed Speculative Attack, which I think it's one of your most notable articles and potentially one of the most notable on the whole of S&I. I think it's one of the most visited pages on the S&I website. And that was written on July 4th, 2024. So as of recording this, and probably around when this ends up getting
2014.
Released. What was that?
You said 2024.
Sorry. This next one we're reading, 2024. Yeah, no, this article, the original Speculative Attack was July 4th, 2014. Which will be having its anniversary around, I think, when this episode will be going live for people who are listening contemporaneously. But today we're going to look at an article that is now already almost a year old that you wrote with Alan Farrington called Speculative Attack Season 2. And the idea around this article, I'll let you explain more, but the idea around this was that the Speculative Attack article was basically extremely prescient and one that people should have paid close attention to. But this is suggesting that the trade being done, the sort of strategy of speculative attacks is only just beginning. And so we actually have a bright future ahead for this to continue. And this is kind of looking at it kind of retrospectively, but also now into the future. It was originally written, like I said, this was written with Alan Farrington for Axiom BTC with the subtitle, The Case for the Greatest Pair Trade in History. And as I understand, this was meant to be a sort of 10th anniversary retrospective. Could you tell us more about kind of the origins of this Speculative Attack follow-up?
Yeah, so in the original Speculative Attack, I kind of laid out the theoretical framework and gave some illustrative examples of what it could look like. But I did caveat that we don't really know exactly what it's going to look like, right? Because there's so many different ways to be able to borrow fiat and buy Bitcoin. So with that caveat in place, I think that the original one was pretty accurate. The update, or what we wanted to look at 10 years later, was, okay, now we have more concrete examples of how speculative attacks are actually being operationalized. And so we go from, I would almost say, axiomatic praxeology into empirical historicism. And so that's the motivation for this one.
That and sort of also just using all of that combined for some entrepreneurial judgment into the future. Just for some final context before we jump in, because I think the numbers speak for themselves. So this article, July 4th, 2024, so 10 years after the original was written, it was, so the price when this came out was about $57,400. When the original came out, the price was about $630. So there was an increase of over 10,000%. So I guess that's what, over 10,000x, a very, very large increase. And even in the year since this article, so in the year since, Bitcoin is up about 82%. Bitcoin is currently hovering around the 105,000 range as of recording. So, and I would also say, maybe you could fill this in, but it seems like the speculative attack is a major driver of that particular increase since a year ago. So you can either confirm or correct me on that as we get into this. But let's go ahead and get in. Introduction. 10 years ago today, present co-author Pierre Rochard published Speculative Attack on the Nakamoto Institute website. Speculative Attack lays out the case that the economic rationale to borrow fiat in order to buy Bitcoin is so overwhelmingly favorable that it is inevitable that this will drive up the price over the long term. The rise could arguably only ever be limited by the spread of information about what Bitcoin even is and why it has properties inviting such a speculative attack in the first place. The price drives news, and news drives the price. Bitcoin was priced at roughly $630 on the day of publication, suggesting a not too shabby return of over 100. Sorry, I way miscalculated. I forgot the percentage decimals, but so return of over 100x in dollar terms, or around 158% annualized. Indeed, Bitcoin has been the best performing asset in the world for most of the single intervening years. While these numbers are unlevered, the original argument was that everybody is also levered to some or other degree when moving beyond financial portfolios and generalizing to include the reality of personal finances, mortgages, student and auto loans, credit card debt, and so on. Any liability a Bitcoiner chooses not to pay down and to buy Bitcoin instead makes this Bitcoiner leveraged. Bitcoiners are speculative attackers. This calculation becomes increasingly extreme the weaker the local currency. Speculative attacks are compelling enough if using US dollars as the strong currency, with liabilities denominated in even more rapidly devaluing currencies. But the presence of an asset as hard as Bitcoin to pair with such a debt changes the game. The returns figures cited just above are magnified even further if one takes as one starting point the Turkish lira or the Argentinian peso. In some fiat currencies, the return cannot even be meaningfully quoted. The difference between the lira and the dollar is one of degree, not of kind. There is no cap to the number of dollars that will ever exist, and no floor to the pressure to continue creating them to satisfy the credit-fueled financial system their presence necessitates. The degree of difference is solely to be found in how urgently insolvent their respective monetary systems are at a given moment in time, and hence how fast a given fiat is printed to both solve the problem now and cause it in the future. This is the essence of the speculative attack. As Bitcoin strengthens, the demand for fiat credit goes up, more is printed, and the problem Bitcoin solves gets even worse. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the introduction before we jump into the meat of the article?
No, I think it does a good encapsulation of the first one.
Great. Season 2. And so, 10 years on, it would appear as if the thesis of speculative attack was absolutely right. The article may well have suggested, for free, on the internet, the single greatest pair trade in the history of financial markets. And yet we find ourselves surveying the terrain today, finding a speculative attack to be an even more fundamentally sound trade than it was 10 years ago. Sound for the individual considering such exposure, and sound as a prediction of the aggregate of market activity. On this, I want to clue in on this first sentence because it's just so incredibly profound to consider that Bitcoin itself, just buying spot Bitcoin, is has been an absolutely incredible, savings vehicle, investment, et cetera, et cetera. But then on top of that, one of the very best strategies of how a trader might want to even, beat just spot Bitcoin was also simply presented for free online and has just, dominated in terms of the market potential for those who engaged in it, obviously in a way that they didn't get wrecked by over-levering themselves. But I think that is it's so profound, given what we were saying about information asymmetry a few episodes back.
Yeah, I agree, and we've been very transparent from the beginning as Bitcoiners, and so I think that the open source ethos lives on the financial side as well.
Yes, it's just interesting because like a lot of kind of financial investment strategies, it tends to be highly proprietary. Of like, oh, we have some secret knowledge about the world, and we're able to use that to make some trades, and then the world will catch up. And with this one, it was operating purely off information asymmetry, where it's out in the open. You don't have to be secretive about it at all. I think there's also something to say. I've heard Saylor say something about this because he was running a business that he took very seriously for decades, and yet he comes across Bitcoin, and once he understands it, he sort of describes it as being basically way better than anything he was ever going to come up. And he doesn't see it as like he doesn't have to come up with the idea per se. He just has to identify it's a good idea and go along for the ride.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It takes some humility to do that. And I actually just saw a post from Jim Chanos, who is taking the opposite side of Saylor. He was saying that if it's such a good idea, why doesn't everyone do it? And I thought to myself, yeah, that. We've all been asking that question for quite a while, Jim.
and Bitcoin has done tremendously in that time period too.
Yeah. Us asking ourselves that question did not stop Bitcoin from performing very well.
Yeah. So instead we should ask. It's actually, I mean, like you're implying, it is a legitimate question. And it's one that we should actually want to be finding good answers to. All of us are, because spreading that more allows these things to come to their full fruition. Now, obviously, at some point, the speculative attack is no longer a profitable trade because you've come to a new equilibrium. But that new equilibrium is so profitable for everyone that's fine.
Yeah, and it's like, Jim, what do you think is going to happen when everybody does finally get it? What's the price going to do? And hopefully that... So I'm going to be debating him in a few weeks, so that'll be interesting to see. Maybe I can orange pill him.
Wonderful. All right, continuing on. There are two clear reasons to believe this. First, fiat is in far worse shape today than it was 10 years ago. Debt to GDP ratios globally have marched upwards. Deficits have spiraled. Banks have failed, as have entire financial markets on occasion. A yet more deranged still version of chartalism has emerged in academia to explain why all of this is actually a good thing. Roughly 1/3 of all dollars in existence have been printed in the past 4 years, never mind 10. As usual, the dollar's reserve currency status means its inflation can largely be exported, and hence weaker currencies are almost all in even worse shape. The list goes on. It becomes clearer and clearer every passing day that none of this can ever be fixed. The necessary political will simply does not exist, and it is unlikely it ever could. And, this goes along with, what, Lynn Alden has been saying, about this train can't be stopped. And we're seeing various political desires to find debt solutions, but none of them really seem to have what it takes to actually put an end to it, because that's such a massive ask. It's nigh impossible.
Yeah, and it's structural, right? So there was a quote of, when the people realize that they can vote to give themselves resources, then it's over. And so I think it's been that way, arguably, since the New Deal. And to me, it's an interesting historical question of how is it that it has lasted so long? And you can kind of say this same question for the Soviet Union or for North Korea, of all this economic miscalculation, all of this value destruction. How can it go on for so long? But I feel like I've been predicting the end of this crazy monetary system for a while now. And it just reminds me of the Chud meme, nothing ever happens. So I feel like there's a combination of nothing ever happens and nothing stops this train, where, yeah, I understand the intellectual argument for an end game. I've made it myself. Still waiting for it to happen.
Yeah, I think there might be something to say as far as, effectively the economic calculation aspect of this, where something like the Soviet Union is going to fail. But even then, it might be that we have to define more clearly what exactly is going to fail. So in many ways, for instance, being able to satisfy actual real consumer demand, if you don't care about that, then you can survive as long as you have just like the capital resources that you can consume. So something like, a place like the United States, which is just, the wealthiest place in the world and does continue to produce things, even though there's a drag on the economy because of all of the inflation, regulation, and so on. Things still get produced, so it's people could debate as to whether it's like true growth but just at a slower rate, or if it's declining but at a slower rate. But with all that, you could still say that perhaps like there are many things about real consumer needs that are being resources are being drawn away from, and that a lot of capital is being consumed because there is a lot of capital that can be consumed. And so these processes of actual end game can take a very long time. And for me, this just goes back into the classic seen versus unseen, as opposed to trying to argue when a particular end game is going to occur, because we can see that, well, given the inflation, given regulations, we are not doing as well as we could. No matter how long you think it's going to take for something to really crash, if ever, we could be doing a lot better if the economy was operating off a sound money standard that was able to more dynamically adjust itself according to real needs and getting people the capital they need to produce towards those.
Yeah, that's right. And there's also, I think, a technological argument that I've heard, which is that we really had a huge breakthrough with semiconductors and software and all electronics and all this, that has essentially subsidized the continued existence of the system.
Yeah, I would like to just clarify that it's not the same as the people who think that big computers solve the calculation problem, but
just that it hides a lot of inflation.
Yes, because you have such high productivity. It can be, if you, let's imagine that you do have a growing society, but it still has this drag. If it's growing really fast, you don't necessarily notice the small drag because you're just enjoying the climb. But there is a drag, and people like me who do care about first world problems should get very upset with that drag, because it means even better things are not being attained.
Right.
Continuing on, the second reason is perhaps more intriguing. The avenues for attack have widened. Speculative attack originally focused on the relatively simple, quote, trade of borrowing in an inflating currency to invest in a harder one. Over the past 10 years, it has become clear that fiat is utterly out of control in leaking de facto monetary premia into practically every asset class in existence. In other words, there are short dollar positions everywhere, almost all of which are involuntary. More suggestively, there are orders of magnitude more dollar shorts looking for a long than there is Bitcoin looking for a hodler. And so, I assume this is just kind of just the broader markets. I mean, we see a lot of asset inflation and, whether it's stocks, real estate, you name it.
Yeah, all these assets have become monetized. I think, though, that in terms of shorting monetary premia, there's probably softer targets and harder targets. So meaning that if you were to try to say, okay, I'm going to short real estate and go long Bitcoin, well, the problem is that people are like very attached to real estate, and so you might be better off finding a different target to a short.
Yes, I mean, and real estate itself is it's literally a harder asset than a lot of these other things. So that should be kind of taken into account. Is like going up the list of things from lowest to highest stock to flow ratios, in a sense of like what are literally the softest in terms of easy creation versus the hardest, is probably a good place to look for speculative attack opportunities, which is why dollars are such a and other currencies are such a soft target, is because they're just printing gazillions of them.
Yeah, and you might actually take an approach of, say, if you have real estate, instead of selling it, you can just borrow against it and then buy Bitcoin with the borrowings.
Right.
I still think you should sell it, though, honestly. It's probably the hardest question I get is, do I sell the asset or do I use the cash flow from it to borrow and buy Bitcoin? And it's like, I think it actually comes down to a question of, do you want to spend time on it? Because ultimately, that's the scarcest resource, is your time. And so if you enjoy doing real estate and being a landlord, then yeah, that's fine. But if you're trying to have quote unquote passive income, that's, there's an easier way to do that by just buying Bitcoin.
That is funny. The passive income types who and sort of fire type people who it's they want to talk about passive income, and then the strategy is to spend like 80 hours a week doing even often like physical labor on houses and stuff to be able to flip them in the market, and deal with tenants and all of this stuff. Selling your chair versus like trying to create an Uber for chairs. The latter just seems like way harder work.
Yeah, 100%.
El Salvador famously made Bitcoin legal tender in 2021, a moment that will surely be looked back on as pivotal in world history. An apparently less newsworthy component of President Bukele's strategy has been to accumulate Bitcoin on the country's balance sheet. As with unpaid mortgages and car loans of individuals, El Salvador has dollar-denominated sovereign bonds. It is borrowing in dollars to buy Bitcoin. El Salvador is a speculative attacker. So I guess this one is a little tricky. I'm not an El Salvador expert, so I can't speak to all of the changes in various IMF loans and what they are able to do and not do with Bitcoin. So last time I heard, Bitcoin is not technically legal tender there anymore, although it's used by many people. They still have Bitcoin on the balance sheet. I believe they are still acquiring daily.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on over there in detail, but it does seem like they have come to an arrangement with the IMF where technically they're complying with the IMF mandate, but technically they're also accumulating Bitcoin.
Yeah. So just to continue on that unsurprisingly, these bonds have done extraordinarily well within the realm of financial performance to be expected from a supposedly, quote, stable asset, meaning its credit rating has improved, its interest rate has fallen, and it can borrow even more cheaply, diverting fewer cash flows to covering its cost of capital and more to accumulating Bitcoin. And this is also something, maybe you have the numbers and so on, but I do believe that El Salvador's credit rating has literally increased quite a bit, and I have to assume that the stability created by Bitcoin being on their balance sheet as a part of their portfolio has helped, even if the creditors probably don't want to say that.
Yeah, well, so I think that they have made progress in balancing the budget and spending less. I think that helps, but you're right that if you're a lender for emerging markets and suddenly this country has $600 million in a very liquid asset, that just mechanically has to improve the credit rating, even if they are not saying that they're going to pay off the debt with the Bitcoin or anything like that. You just know that there's one more substantial asset. But we have to keep it in perspective. I think that El Salvador has like $20 billion of debt and $600 million worth of Bitcoin. So, how it's not like they're over collateralized and that's driving down their cost of borrowing. I think
Right,
it's
right.
really the confidence that people have in Bukele's balancing the budget and then growing the economy.
Yeah, and I was also thinking more for President Bukele himself, the confidence that he has in balancing the budget, knowing that he's also working on this particular monetary strategy.
Yeah,
So very indirectly giving him, when you just start to get a little bit of savings, that can be a good feedback loop into, you know, more confidence in a lot of other things in your life. Which is one
definitely.
of the reasons savings is so important for people in general, is you start to have more of a feeling of control in your life.
I think the 21D chess move is that he is using this as a negotiation leverage with the IMF. So he's able to get a lower interest rate loan from the IMF by telling them, well, I don't need you, but if you want us to work together, you've got to give me good terms. And in return, I'll, not make Bitcoin legal tender anymore. And so it's a very, I think, yeah, it could just be part of a negotiation with the IMF to try to get really good borrowing terms. And I think that that's that's to Bitcoin's credit that you can actually say, hey, I have an alternative here to using your system. So you have to actually meet me where I'm at.
Yes. Continuing on. Or consider MicroStrategy, now Strategy, which has famously pioneered a strategy not only of accumulating a Bitcoin treasury, but of tapping credit and equity markets to accelerate its accumulation. As the price of Bitcoin in dollar terms inevitably rises, MicroStrategy's leverage and interest coverage becomes healthier, its interest goes down, and it can afford to buy more Bitcoin and issue more debt. As its stock prices as its stock price rises, equally unsurprising given it is levered to Bitcoin, it can issue more stock and buy more Bitcoin. Its stock has no cap, and neither do the dollars being used to buy it. It is sucking up freshly minted dollars with nowhere better to go and using them to buy Bitcoin. MicroStrategy is a speculative attacker. Imitators are not far behind, with Semler Scientific and Metaplanet Inc. having copied this playbook to a T much more recently and seen literally immediate appreciation in capital markets. On a long enough time horizon, we expect the share of equity market participants adopting a similar strategy to trend to 100%. Public Bitcoin mining companies are arguably even more potent and concentrated versions of the same phenomenon. The financial profile of a public miner is effectively to go short equity markets and long local hash rate, the latter of which it is naturally assumed will translate into a long Bitcoin position. Miners are speculative attackers. On the Metaplanet, they've grown tremendously. I haven't seen as much with Semler Scientific, although I assume they're doing well. But Metaplanet in particular became the highest gross,
Yeah.
in the Japanese markets, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. So if you had read this when it was published a year ago, and you had went out and bought Metaplanet, you would have done really well. But even if you had bought MicroStrategy, you would have done really well. I mean, I think that we forget that the hype around Bitcoin treasury companies really started like 6 months ago. And so I'd argue this article was like prescient in the short term.
Yeah, that's a good point. This was extremely fresh. And it's interesting how long it took MicroStrategy to do its thing before people kind of really caught on to
5 years.
Yeah.
5 years. And to me that speaks to how slow we are as humans, but I also think that it speaks to you need to go through a Bitcoin cycle.
Yes.
And prove out your conviction and also prove out the financial engineering to prove that it doesn't blow up. And then once you get that level of confidence, well, now you can really expand.
Yes, and that's sort of how I've kind of conceptualized this cycle, so to speak, is that the last cycle was MicroStrategy venturing off pioneering new way of thinking about Bitcoin as a large part of basically the corporate treasury strategy. And this cycle as being people who they'd seen that happen, and now you have more entrepreneurs who want to try to imitate that. And then perhaps it is possible that the next cycle is more of when, assuming this cycle also goes well, that it becomes a much more mainstream thing.
Yeah.
But that's pure speculation. Continuing. Little-known hedge fund Kerrisdale Capital recently got in on this act, angering many Bitcoiners with its supposedly anti-mining commentary, but burying the lead of its, quote, short miners long Bitcoin pair trade. One can, humorously, but still accurately, recognize the commutative algebra of lining up these pair trades such that Kerrisdale is effectively contributing the final piece to a, quote, short equity markets long Bitcoin trade. Hedge funds are speculative attackers. Can you explain that one a little bit more?
Yeah, so basically the mining industry is the most competitive industry in the world. Let's start with that. And so it's been very challenging at times for them to have solid profit margins and thus, solid financial prospects and trading multiples. So Kerrisdale, I don't know that they had thought this through that much, but in any case, you could certainly look at charts of Bitcoin mining company stock and with the benefit of hindsight say they were overvalued here. So if you have a short seller who is going to short a mining stock and they want to avoid the risk, okay, we were shorting a mining stock because we think that Bitcoin mining is a very competitive industry and so the profit margins will compress. What would throw a wrench into that thesis would be Bitcoin going up. And so in order to isolate that risk, what they do is they buy Bitcoin, so they go long Bitcoin, and then they short the mining stock so that really what they're shorting is the value between Bitcoin and the mining stock and not the value between the mining stock and fiat. But as we point out here, that means that you are buying Bitcoin. So you are actually contributing to the speculative attack. And same thing goes for Jim Chanos now, actually, because he is shorting MicroStrategy and going long Bitcoin and saying that, hey, a company trading at a multiple of the value of the Bitcoin on its balance sheet is irrational. And so this trade that I'm putting on is making sense. But he's adding to the reflexivity where if he is buying Bitcoin, that benefits MicroStrategy. So yeah, it's a very interesting dilemma.
Yeah. Best of luck to all the shorters.
Yes. We wish them well.
One might wonder where these dollars come from and why they're looking for assets in the first place. Well, to once again refer to our first point of just how far fiat has deteriorated in the past 10 years, perhaps the most startling development is the volume of direct intervention in capital markets and stockpiling of listed securities on the balance sheets of central banks worldwide. This has simply become necessary recently to prevent, or at least forestall, the collapse of the fiat Ponzi. Such is the leverage forced into every monetizable nook and cranny. It is worth reminding oneself that not only have equity, credit, and real estate markets and beyond become de facto monetized, but that their monetary premia are dependent on their holders being leveraged. In some sense, they are defined this way. The ever-spiraling collapse of fiat has the same dynamics whether Bitcoin is present or not. Securities have monetized in the first place due to asset allocators going long real assets and short the dollar in order to protect themselves from the dollar's slow-motion collapse. The conundrum these allocators now face is that Bitcoin is significantly harder than equity, credit, or even real estate. Quote, shorting equity markets is really betting on the transfer of the monetary premium of equities to something else. and given the leverage supporting the existence of the premium in equities in the first place, this trend cannot fail to be largely self-fulfilling once it gains sufficient momentum. The more central bankers inflate bubbles in each and every asset class under the sun, the more will top-heavily topple into the well of Bitcoin, the only true scarce asset and the only real money around. Central bankers are speculative attackers. There's a lot of different kinds of Bitcoin skeptics. I think notably, for instance, like the environmental ones, who dislike mining because they see all of the energy usage, the electricity going into Bitcoin mining, and they view that as an attack on the environment. Those people, they tend not to, have an understanding of why people want Bitcoin in the first place. So like, why is it actually profitable for this to be happening at all, such that it does happen? What makes it productive? And the answer, of course, is that it's helping produce, decentralized consensus. And that's useful because of the ability to ensure a strict monetary policy and, censorship resistance and all of the good things that we like about Bitcoin. And they sort of miss that. And they don't think that it's like, well, if you could go get the politicians, you could get the central bankers, et cetera, to stop what they're doing, we wouldn't have needed this thing in the first place. So you're getting mad at the wrong people. Bitcoin is not the one that came in and made this mess. Bitcoin is here to bring a solution to the mess. And likewise here, when we're looking at the behaviors of these different companies, Bitcoin is just coming in. These dynamics are already occurring. Bitcoin is just coming in as the most pristine solution for everyone to be using as this kind of shelling point, and what becomes the sort of black hole of the investments.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that came up during those environmentalist debates, was this question of scope 2 emissions. And basically they were saying, okay, yeah, the electric Bitcoin mining rig, sure, that doesn't emit CO2, but by virtue of buying electricity, you are incentivizing somebody else to go burn natural gas or coal to generate electricity that will have CO2 emissions. And then it's like, okay, well, what is incentivizing Bitcoin mining? Right? Because if we're going to say this causal chain can go back to the nth degree of what is causing what, well, then we have to continue. We can't stop at the Bitcoin mining rig. The Bitcoin mining rig is just responding to the incentives from the value of Bitcoin increasing. And what's causing that? Well, it's central banks, arguably, right? So, if we were to ascribe Bitcoin mining's scope 2 emissions, maybe they should actually, the ultimate responsibility should be with the fiat institutions that led to the popularity of Bitcoin. But I think that it's an interesting question, because I actually think that even you could imagine a world where, okay, there's only going to be $21 million and they enforce that. It's interesting to question, how much would that slow down Bitcoin adoption? Because there's the advantage of Bitcoin being open source, it being permissionless. So there's other advantages, but I think that it would very, very strongly slow down Bitcoin adoption.
Yes, agreed. Because it's the arbitrage between Bitcoin and the other options on the market are really what motivate the demand. I think this is, we've talked about number go up being such a powerful force, and if you don't have that, you can talk about the features that are so interesting, but at that point, in some sense, you kind of are like Ethereum guys or other altcoiners. It's like, well, ours has a different block time or something. It's like, yeah, that might actually be awesome, whatever it is that you're offering, like open source and so on and so forth. But is that enough to move the entire global economy?
Right. And I think that enrages the cypherpunk contingency that really doesn't like number go up and sees that as it's just speculation, and that we're in it for the technology. To point out that, the technology on its own really probably would be very marginal in its adoption. It really would be. And this is the critique of Bitcoin. It's Esperanto of currencies. Yeah, that would be the case if there was not number go up.
Yeah, and this would actually be an interesting, kind of research project into the cypherpunk archives, is trying to get a sense of where they may have actually identified this, of kind of various arbitrage opportunities as being the catalyst for adoption of various cypherpunk technologies. And I do think that there's quite a bit of that, of recognizing that there are literally things that are not possible without this technology. Therefore, it could be very useful, especially in the case of various kinds of global trade, where you have to deal with what one article called the sort of like swamp of jurisdictional stuff. If you have a more kind of objective technology that's able to arbitrage all of that, then that might be like a great reason for people to adopt it. But simply putting it in front of people and saying, hey, look at how cool this is, that's not necessarily going to mean as much, because ultimately you do have to look at the margins of economic decisions, which is where everything is actually happening. So at the margins, is this making such an improvement in people's lives that people adopt new technology Y over old technology X?
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting question, and I think that those margins really do matter. You can't escape economics. Continuing on, and while one may be tempted to think of Bitcoin itself as in some sense above all these dirty fiat games, Zen-like in its calm acceptance of eventual yet inevitable acquisition of all monetary premia worldwide, even this is not quite true. Bitcoin is such a pristine asset that its growing value makes it increasingly attractive as collateral against which ever-depreciating fiat can be borrowed. Unchained is well known for popularizing the Bitcoin-backed loan, an over-collateralized fiat loan, paying healthy interest to the lender and suffering zero loan losses to date. This has so far been aimed mostly at Bitcoiners looking to realize some of their newfound wealth without having to sell. However, we strongly predict this model will morph into a tool of corporate finance and demonetization arbitrage. Bitcoin holders still typically have fiat bills to pay. Capital markets participants engaging in, however roundabout of a speculative attack, will have a fiat cost of capital to cover. Selling Bitcoin to cover these costs would require forfeiting the expected long-term gains, and in the short term would put downwards pressure on the price and be contrary to the overall strategy, however marginally. Whereas the flood of dollars looking for assets is so torrential, it will happily find a trade in the mere potential of acquiring Bitcoin in the case of default, all the while having the principal value protected, in dollar terms at least, by the inevitability of Bitcoin's monetization. This is an interesting point where, because Bitcoin is so good, anyone who, wants to play fiat games has basically the ultimate tool to play those fiat games at a harder and harder level. And the more that it succeeds, the even better that it's able to do that. And so, I think this is an interesting pushback on people who view all of the fiat games with disdain, which I totally understand, because on a personal level, I cannot stand debt. And that's one of the things that I like about Bitcoin is, being able to use it as just savings and not having to, introduce fiat debt into my life in order to live my life. I'm fine with not speculatively attacking things and making an extra profit, because I don't like that. I just don't like debt. But that's just me. And we live in a global economy where a lot of people, they have interests in making a lot of money and making moves in the market, and they're naturally going to do that. And Bitcoin, the fact that people are using Bitcoin in this way, rather than being seen as Bitcoin losing its ethos, is, you could also view it as much the opposite, which is it is a vindication of Bitcoin's ethos that it is capable of powering these kinds of market arbitrages.
Yeah, I recently made the point that this is actually Wall Street losing its ethos, right? Where the ethos of Wall Street was that you're supposed to be financing burrito purchases and, subprime mortgages, not the best asset in the world. But it's capitulation. I mean, they have to recognize that this is just a better asset than anything else they're working with.
Yes, and we've kind of been saying that for years. It's like, Bitcoin doesn't need Wall Street. Wall Street needs Bitcoin. And so on and so forth. And in future articles, we're going to be talking about kind of a similar process with governments.
Well, it's a funny thing because I've heard people be like, Pierre, you're supposed to not like stocks and bonds and banks and all this stuff. And my gut reaction to that is, yeah, I don't like that they don't use Bitcoin. It's like that's what I don't like about it. It's not about the patriarchy or some kind of other grudge I have against these institutions, and even the central banks. Let's say the Fed came out and said, "Hey, we're going to back every dollar with 1 sat in cold storage." I'd have a really hard time arguing against that. It would be so. I think that would be a good development, which others would say, "Oh, you've lost your way," but I don't know that I have.
Yeah. I mean, there'd probably be maybe some like privacy issues to worry about concerning like using a particular payment system. But that's just how using any payment system is going to be, is you have to make those choices. And I also think it's good when people try to do basically be a market, decentralized consumer reports, helping people make the trade-offs they actually want to make, as opposed to kind of having them hidden away. But when we've been arguing against central banks for all this time, that, like, yes, that is a big issue, but I don't know if it's the biggest issue, because even if it was using pure Xiaomi and eCash, if they are changing the base monetary system underneath it and using that to create seigniorage that's used to do all of the things that the government does, from warfare to welfare and everything in between, that's a way bigger problem. And like I said, it's like you could even be using a pure Xiaomi and eCash for such a system and have perfect privacy, but that underlying monetary debasement is being wielded for absolutely heinous things that are completely destructive to the economy. And it's that we've seen as the sort of principal antagonist in our economic system. And so there are ways, like when you get rid of that, like you've gotten rid of the principal antagonist, and it's like what a blessing it would be to just kind of be concerned about some of these other issues.
By the way, Michael, I saw recently, I think we're going to be onboarding Antifa onto Bitcoin very soon, because I saw that they are cracking down on the financing of Antifa's protests, which quite often have turned very violent and destructive of private property. So they're cracking down on that and tracing kind of the money flows through the fiat system. So maybe these folks will start learning about Bitcoin and Lightning in order to try to circumvent this financial regulation. It's kind of like the Canadian truckers, right? But eventually, I think they'll warm to the idea that, hey, these Bitcoin are going up in value. Maybe we should stop spending it on violent street protests and just start saving money and start a family and get a real job.
And if that's happening, I think that's a very interesting dynamic in that basically their enemy in this case is also adopting a similar strategy. So it really goes to show that Bitcoin is this sort of, shall we say, sort of pre-political thing. That it has its raw economic capacity, and no matter your politics, you kind of have to be cognizant of the reality of, number go up.
I like I think this should be like a skit or something of the Antifa meeting where one guy's like, hey, Bitcoin's a joke. Why would we use Bitcoin? And some other guy says, yeah, but Larry Fink thinks it's a real thing, like he's the head of BlackRock. So we should listen to him. It's institutional grade. We can use it for Antifa.
There was an old Whitest Kid You Know sketch where the anarchists finally win in their uprising. So effectively that sort of anarchist group. Yeah, they succeed in their thing. And one of the guys is like, hey, yeah, like we're having fun and all, but just FYI, there's like this nuclear reactor up the road, and someone needs to like watch it because we don't want a nuclear meltdown. And they basically start, though the whole sketch is them having to effectively reform a government in order to deal with that fact. And so, yeah, having the Bitcoin version of that would be quite humorous. I think if things were to continue, I don't believe that Antifa is treated as a designated terrorist organization. But if it were to escalate to that point, perhaps that would also be the end of us having to hear that Bitcoin is for terrorists.
Right.
So, Bitcoin continues to win, and I personally hope that it changes the hearts and minds and economic patterns of, all sorts of people.
Yeah, it might also just dawn on them of, oh, well, we've been fighting for financial inclusion, and now we finally figured out that we don't need to fight for it. We can just download this wallet.
Yes, so you too should start a treasury corporation.
That's the next move for Antifa, the Antifa accumulation vehicle.
Yeah, and it can be decentralized. Each member gets to hold their own,
and I'm sure that George Soros will contribute, the seed capital for that.
And who better to help with a speculative attack than George Soros himself, which would also mean you would have George Soros on one side, Scott Bessent on the other. There really is a lot of 21-dimensional chess going on here.
World peace is at hand.
The only limiting factor on these modalities of speculative attack will be Bitcoin's fiat-denominated price volatility. Those who are too aggressive and reckless in their leverage risk liquidation in the inevitable short-term drawdowns of this rapid monetization. As herd mentality contributes to adoption progressing in waves rather than monotonically, risk management will be key to sustain the attacks. So for anyone who's reading this, be sure to think clearly about what you do choose to engage in. If you are choosing to engage in that, people do get wrecked, and you don't want to be one of those.
No, you're actually undermining the speculative attack if you overextend yourself and get liquidated. So please cool your jets, folks. Let's work together.
Yes. So, conclusion. The more mainstream Bitcoin becomes, the more compelling the speculative attack will be. Eventually, it will become necessary, and not long after that, it will simply cease to be possible, as nobody will trade Bitcoin for any amount of fiat, or even risk its loss in financial calculation. While we are clearly incredibly far along from 2014, we are nowhere near this final state. The slow motion collapse of fiat continues, and the avenues for directing fiat shorts to Bitcoin longs widen. The speculative attack lives on. Season 2 begins. So, something I kind of take away from a lot of this is there used to be a thing, as the fiat bubbles were really getting bubbly in the 2010s and into the 2020s. But there was this idea that, all companies were becoming financial companies. So it's like every company under the sun has their own credit card, and they're basically becoming this big credit institution. And that's them effectively playing all these fiat games. And I think it's kind of shifting. It's like now all companies are becoming Bitcoin treasury companies.
Yeah, it's exactly what we want in terms of having a somewhat decentralized speculative attack. We could think about what would hamper this. I mean, if I was Elizabeth Warren, which to be clear, I'm not, folks, okay, just to put some rumors to bed there. If I were her, I would say, hey, look, I'm perfectly fine with individuals holding Bitcoin. That's what Bitcoin's all about. It's all about decentralization and empowering individuals. I'm not okay with corporations owning Bitcoin. Okay, so you can't have more than 10% of your balance sheet in Bitcoin, and that just go hard on that. And that I think that she could actually make more inroads with that messaging than she did with her Bitcoin mining stuff. Although I would also argue that she really fumbled the ball on the Bitcoin mining stuff. What she should have done is said, I'm perfectly fine with you mining Bitcoin at home. That's great for decentralization. I'm not okay with industrial sized Bitcoin mining. Okay, that's just bad for the environment. And that she would have actually divided Bitcoiners. Like some Bitcoiners would be like, yeah, mining should be decentralized. So let's ban these big players. And it would have isolated kind of the industrial scale Bitcoin miners and had a higher probability of success than her approach of just saying all Bitcoin mining is bad.
Yes, it's like you don't want the factory mined Bitcoin. You want the
organic,
yeah, regenerative Bitcoin mining.
Yeah. Even though factually, I would argue the opposite, that mining at home is worse for the environment because ultimately the economies of scale means that you have a smaller impact on the environment. Yeah, and so you're having to produce more electricity at the power plant because you're having to send electricity through the entire transmission and distribution system, and there's a loss of electricity in the transportation of it.
Yes, as opposed to getting it right at the source. So, I mean, we could also, develop home, nuclear reactors and such. But even then, you'd be better off like having a giant nuclear reactor that you can attach some miners to. So, So there has been a sort of discussion recently about these Bitcoin treasury companies. People are they don't necessarily like the naming of it because it's almost unclear. Some people have pointed out that it's like, well, any company that has Bitcoin on their balance sheet is a Bitcoin treasury company, and there's something different about a company that is then trying to earn its profits by actually engaging in speculative attacks and fiat arbitrage and such. Do you have any thoughts on how we might clarify these things?
I don't think it's the name that needs to change. I think it's the companies that need to change. Okay, so meaning that I think every company should be doing the like full playbook 100% Bitcoin, right? And so that's that. So like for example, Tesla or even Coinbase is saying, oh, we're just going to dip our toes in. That I think is to the detriment of their shareholders, and I don't think we should change the name of Bitcoin treasury companies to accommodate those who are lukewarm on Bitcoin. So that's my gut reaction to that. I think because I think that Bitcoin treasury company has a lot of mimetic power, and it's very accurate. Like a corporate treasury holds cash, Bitcoin's long-term cash. Like it's not. Yeah, I like the terminology.
BTC.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think something that I might add to that is, from what we've talked about with Bitcoin as, the best unit of account and so on and so forth, with a company that's, full-on treasury company engaging in fiat arbitrage and speculative attacks, and those companies in some ways, might actually be more honest to themselves, recognizing that that's actually the best way that they can make money. And, for companies that might just want to dip their toes, it is quite possible that some of them lack the humility to recognize that actually what they're doing is not as profitable in the marketplace as they might want to believe. And then on the other hand, the more companies are taking these things, taking these strategies with, going all in on Bitcoin on their balance sheet and everything, the quicker we get to the end of the speculative attacks anyway, and we can all get back to, doing other things, because we will have repriced capital accordingly. So yeah, I mean, companies should really take an honest look at all of their costs, all of their profits, everything. Like really look at the numbers and determine how well are they doing really in the economy versus those who are focused even more on a Bitcoin denominated strategy.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Do you have anything else to add on this before we sign off?
No, obviously very excited to write part 3 in 9 years, where we'll have more to say, I guess. When I wrote A Speculative Attack, I remember having the thought of, okay, well, I'm done writing about Bitcoin. Now I just need to wait for these predictions to come true. And now it's like, okay, they came true. All right, I guess I got to write more about Bitcoin or something.
Yeah, now there's the, you can engage in just actually spreading that education so that it happens even more so. Yeah, and I ultimately, I don't know if it'll be in 9 years or 19 or more, but looking forward to the post-mortem when the dust has finally settled, and what that might look like at the time.
$1 million Bitcoin.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today. And thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the SNI archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.